that 2016 is about electing a commander-in-chief who is prepared to do what it takes to keep this country safe so we can remain free. You've been a very vocal and outspoken in your criticism of the Iran deal. Let's say that there's a President Rubio in January of 2017. How do you deal with Iran?
Well, first let me tell you why the deal is no deal at all. Second, I'll tell you how we'll reverse it. And third, I'll tell you what we'll do instead. It really is no deal at all because the first thing about the Iran deal that we need to understand is it releases billions of dollars of frozen assets into the hands of Iran. So what will Iran do with that money? Are they going to build roads and bridges and schools and charities? No. They're going to do what they've always done with money. They're going to invest it, number one, in terrorism, sponsorship of Hezbollah, sponsorship of Shia militias in Iraq, sponsorship of the 14th of February movement in Bahrain, sponsorship of the Houthis. Second, they're going to develop their conventional capabilities, their ability to destroy, for example, an American aircraft carrier by buying Chinese technology to do it, and thereby posing the risk of a blockade, for example, of the Straits of Hormuz or in the Persian Gulf. And third, they're going to develop their long-range rockets and ultimately their nuclear weapons program. Why would you build long-range ICBMs? There's only one reason, and that is to put a nuclear warhead on it. They're not trying to put a man on the moon or send a probe to Mars. The only reason you build long-range rockets is to put a nuclear warhead on it, and that alone should tell us everything we need to know. The U.S. Congress imposed sanctions on Iran and on individuals and on banks and on other sectors of their economy. And those sanctions are in the books today. What this president is going to do is he is going to use the national security waiver in that law to lift those sanctions. When I'm president of the United States, we will reimpose those sanctions. We will remove that national security waiver. And countries around the world and their companies that do business in Iran will have a choice to make. They could either have access to the Iranian economy or they could have access to the American economy. But they will not have access to both. And not only will we reimpose those sanctions, I hope we can add additional terrorists, additional banks, and additional entities to that sanctions list. And we will continue to do that until Iran realizes that they have a very simple choice. They can have an economy or they can have a nuclear weapon program, but they cannot have both. And that's the position that we need to find ourselves here over the next couple of years.
You talk about the nuclear threat, you talk about the intercontinental ballistic missile threat from Iran. Here in Greenville, South Carolina, and on the East Coast, we have no land-based missile defense capability for this country. What would you do to strengthen missile defense?
Well, I think missile defense against an Iranian threat actually begins in Europe. It's the first opportunity for us to intercept a launch. And in fact, I think that helps us not just against the threat of an Iranian weapon, but also the existing threat of a Russian attack, which today, as ludicrous as it may sound, we are on the verge of a second Cold War by Vladimir Putin's choice, not because of ours. And so I think the ability to protect our allies in the U.S. begins with a missile defense system in Europe as the first line of intercept. Ultimately, I do believe that an East Coast system is important for our country as well. We are living in an era where the proliferation of long-range missiles is going to move rapidly. North Korea now possesses them and is increasingly improving their targeting capability. Obviously, Russia has them, China has them, and Iran is trying to get them. And so this will also be an era of missile defense, and we need to be prepared for it.
Talk about Russia. Russia bears back with Vladimir Putin. How do you work with our key allies like Great Britain and the Germans to confront Putin?
Well, it's important to understand that economically Russia is not a global power. They are militarily. 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are in the hands of the United States and Russia. So that alone is a reason to be concerned. And we have to understand that our quarrel is not with the Russian people. It's with Vladimir Putin, who has decided that he is going to, the way he's going to reposition Russia once again as a global power, at least in his mind, is to split Europe, undermine Europe, try to undermine NATO, and ultimately challenge the United States. He has made a decision that the way he's going to become prominent in the world is by obstructing or being against us everywhere in the world. In essence, the other thing he's begun to do is he's begun to create problems that only he himself can solve in order to position himself as this great global leader. So he arms and equips the Syrian regime, and then when they conduct these chemical attacks, only he is in a position to broker a deal to get them to abandon their weapons, which, by the way, they haven't done. They're still using chlorine gas against their own people. But this is the way he positions himself, and this president has fallen into that trap.
We went out on social media asking people to send their questions in, what they wanted to ask. We received one question from a Sweden senator, and the question was from Sweden. So we've gotten some interest in on national security here. The question was this: How do we stop the expansion of ISIS?
Well, that's first of all, you stop the expansion of ISIS the way you stop the expansion of any radical jihadist group, and that is you deny them a safe haven from which to operate. In order for a jihadist group to grow, prosper, recruit, train, and conduct operations, they need somewhere to operate from. Al-Qaeda needed the sponsorship of the Taliban to plan 9/11, and ISIS needed Syria, the instability there, now Iraq, increasingly Libya, and other places as an operational space. We have to deny them these operational spaces. In fact, the next place ISIS will focus on is Afghanistan. And you already see within Afghanistan a battle between ISIS and the Taliban to become the predominant Sunni radical movement on the ground in Afghanistan. And as America retreats from different parts of Afghanistan, ISIS is moving in and improving their capabilities there as well. So we have to target them in their safe havens. Obviously Syria and Iraq, but I think that needs to be expanded at some point to include the areas of Libya where they operate from and are using it as a base of operations to destabilize the Sinai. I also think we have to begin to think about confronting them in Afghanistan as well. Not to mention all these affiliate groups around the world that have now pledged allegiance to ISIS. Confronting them means ultimately confronting them on the ground. I believe we have to increase air assaults against them, and I think it's been important in degrading their logistical capabilities, their ability to resupply, etc. But in the short term, we need to subject them to some high-profile, humiliating defeats so we could reverse this global narrative that ISIS is unstoppable. That's how they're attracting recruits. They put up very well-produced videos on social media, and the message they're sending to young jihadists around the world is, join us, we're unstoppable. We have to prove that wrong. So I do think some special operations attacks in combination with increased airstrikes is important in the short term. But in the long term, ISIS must be defeated on the ground, and I think ideally defeated on the ground by local forces, including Sunnis themselves, who will confront them militarily with our help, including the help of American special operators, but also with intelligence support, logistical support, airstrikes, and targeting assistance that will allow, for example, a combination of Egyptians, Jordanians, Saudis, Sunnis in Iraq themselves, and Kurds and others to confront them and defeat them on the ground and take back the territory they now control.
We talked about social media. How do we fight ISIS on social media? And are Facebook and Twitter, are they doing enough?
Well, part of it is defeating them in the propaganda battle. You know, every war in our history has had a propaganda element to it. If you go back and look at the old newsreels of World War II, where we were constantly propping up the American people, pointing out the successes we've had, and of course the Nazis and others invested heavily in propaganda. Vladimir Putin today invests heavily in propaganda, not just in Russia, but throughout the world. There's a television network you may or may not have seen called Russia Today. It's on some cable systems. It basically is run by the Kremlin. It's decided to spread propaganda. And I think it's important for the U.S. to also win the information battle. And so it does begin by subjecting them to humiliating defeats and advertising it to the world. But I also think we should target them online. I think there's no reason why as a country, we should allow ISIS unfettered access to Facebook and Twitter and all sorts of other platforms that they use not just to attract recruits, but to inspire attacks against us, the West, and the world.
It's now reported that ISIS may have as many as 100 youth jihadist camps, training camps. What can we do with regards to young people to offer them hope in this country? What can we do about that?
Well, to offer them hope in this country, you mean domestic, here in the United States,
Yes.
or around the world?
Both.
Well, look, around the world, we have some people in the United States that have been radicalized online for a lot of different reasons. Some of these are just disenchanted, quite frankly, losers who are looking to be part of something bigger than themselves, and this movement has attracted them. Others have just had this weird conversion that they've been radicalized, and ISIS in their mind is the most high-profile and successful radical jihadist movement on the planet, and so they seek to join it or carry out attacks inspired by it. So that's why this whole instance that I just pointed to, this whole idea that we need to defeat them in the information wars is important. But I think globally it's important as well to deny them the operating spaces for those camps to take root. And ultimately that's why it's so important that Sunnis themselves participate in the defeat of ISIS. ISIS is a radical Sunni movement. It finds its strength from disaffected Sunni youth. And so it's important for us to work with our Sunni allies in the region. People need to see that ISIS is being defeated by fellow Sunnis. That this is not just a Western crusade, as they like to call it, against Islam. These are Sunni Muslims themselves who are rebelling against a radical, violent, abhorrent system. And I think that's a critical part of this as well.
Historically, we have four dimensions of warfare: air, land, sea, and space, and now we've got cyber. and it's killing us. I mean, it's like death by 1,000 hacks. How do we win the cyber war?
Well, first we have to improve the quality of our cyber defenses. The truth is that most government agencies simply do not employ 21st century best practices. If you compare the cyber defense of a private sector firm to what most federal agencies have, we're well behind. In fact, 2 to 3 generations behind. And so I think one of the emergent challenges of the 21st century for the next commander-in-chief is to improve the cyber defense capabilities of our government agencies, but also to pass a cyber bill, which I hope we'll do here in the next couple of weeks in the U.S. Senate, that will help us with more information sharing with the private sector. Cyber is rapidly evolving, and so once you solve one problem, 5 new ones are being created by an innovative hacker somewhere or some new development that's occurred. We need to stay at the cutting edge of that, and that will require us to be able to share best practices information between government and the private sector. But I also think we need to improve our cyber offensive capabilities. Mutually assured destruction that existed during the Cold War on the nuclear front is something that's important in cyber as well. I think that will be effective when it comes to our relationship vis-a-vis other nation states like China and Russia. But I also think it's important, not that the deterrent themselves will work, but I also think it's important that we have the cyber capability to knock out the ability of a radical group like ISIS or a transnational criminal group for that matter to conduct operations in cyberspace. And you talked about some of those other areas. Critical to that is space defense, because our potential adversaries realize that it doesn't matter how advanced our technology may be. If they can destroy or blind our satellites, our guidance systems don't work, our communication systems don't work, we lose the technological high ground that's so dependent on those satellites and on cyberspace.
This recent cyber attack on the Office of Personnel Management by the Chinese took our government 4 or 5 months to discover it. How would a Rubio administration deal with the Chinese?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, that we admit as this administration to give them credit has done. It flat out said that it's the Chinese who are conducting these attacks, and that's important. I think beyond it, I think it's important that there be a reciprocal response. If we're going to be attacked in cyber by China, we have to show the willingness to do the same. And again, I don't want to get into a cyber war, but I'm telling you, unilateral disarmament only encourages other nations to do more of this. The Chinese today believe that the costs of cyber warfare are outweighed by the benefits. They think they gain more than lose, and they think they can get away with it. So yes, it's great that we're indicting senior Chinese officials that are conducting cyber warfare. The truth is we'll never get our hands on them because they're not going to target here. They're not going to travel here. I think we need to go further. And I think for each cyber attack that we can verify, there needs to be a reciprocal response that lets others know that if you attack America in cyber, we will respond. I think it's also an emergent issue of national importance that we improve our ability to defend against these attacks and be able to improve our data. And there exists in the private sector mechanisms to do that are superior to what our government uses today.
Our top cyber experts at the NSA and CIA tell us that we need between 20 and 30,000 real, true cyber experts to thwart the worst kind of attacks in this country. We've only got 1,000. How do we have the kind of recruitment campaign we need to get cyber experts?
Well, here's the good news. And the good news is that this young generation of Americans is the most cyber tech savvy generation that's ever lived. These are young people that have grown up around technology their whole lives. In fact, they have no notion of what the world looked like before social media or the ability to access instant information. So I think we have the ability in this country to create a cyber defense force and recruit for it, much like we've done in the past for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. And I think there'll be millions of young Americans who would be interested in joining that sort of effort. Now, of course, we're not going to hire millions of people, but the ability to go out and actually begin to recruit people to become part of America's cyber defense is something that I think will appeal to millions of young Americans, and thousands of whom we will find qualified and prepared to fill that role. It would be another way of serving our country, the way people have served in the past in uniform.
King Abdullah of Jordan recently came to the U.S. Congress and complained to members that our State Department was putting up bureaucratic roadblocks, the things that he needed to take the fight to radical Islam and ISIS. How would you work with the King Abdullah, and what kind of role would he play in your foreign policy in the Mideast?
Well, first, understand Jordan's challenges are extremely significant. Jordan really doesn't have a well-developed economy. They're not an oil-producing nation. Their economy largely is sustained by foreign aid from the Gulf kingdoms and the United States, and that's a long-term challenge that Jordan needs to confront. They also have a significant portion of their population that feels disconnected and disaffected by the current system of government and economics. And long term, that's a toxic brew that could lead to rebellion and instability in that country. So those are issues we need to help Jordan deal with. Their most immediate threat is, number one, they have a refugee camp on their border that today houses hundreds of thousands of people, and that just 1,000 of them are radical jihadists. They've got a major problem. So I think it's important. Jordan is a willing partner in this effort. I think it's important for us to allow them to improve their military capabilities with unfettered access to the sort of military aid that they're asking for, renew our commitment to that. I think it's important for us to help them deal with the crisis they're facing at the border. The truth is that the aid has been slow in coming, not just from the UN, but from the U.S., about providing what they need to gain control of that border region that today is being flooded by Syrian refugees, most of whom are not radical jihadists. But as I said, if just a small percentage of them are infiltrated, you suddenly have a major, major problem in Jordan.
Turkey's been called probably our least dependable NATO ally. On one hand, they're bombing ISIS. On the other hand, they're bombing the Kurds. How do you deal with the Turks?
Well, it's a real challenge there. Turkey was admitted to NATO at a time when their government was behaving quite differently from what it is today. Their current leaders have taken them on a more jihadist, radical Islamic, traditional Islamic approach that I think has made it harder to work with them on a number of issues. It wasn't long ago that Turkey was an ally of Israel. And today, of course, that's no longer the case the way it once was. So it's important to re-examine that relationship and, quite frankly, to put it to the test. I mean, either the Turks are going to allow us to use Turkish airspace and Turkish bases, or they're not in terms of targeting this. I think it's important for them to express a willingness to participate in an anti-ISIS coalition that simply goes beyond their worries about the Kurds, but in fact extends to the need to defeat ISIS. Now, the Turks would come back and say, well, we're concerned because we don't think any of these challenges in the region will be solved until you roll Assad into the mix. In essence, unless you get rid of Assad and ISIS, you're still going to have a problem. And I think there's some legitimacy to that. I think ultimately, as long as Assad is in power in any portion of Syria, you're going to continue to have the raw elements that made ISIS possible in the first place. Even if we wipe out ISIS tomorrow, a new group will emerge. It could be Jabhat al-Nusra, which is already in ISIS. And quite frankly, that was the group a lot of people thought would be ISIS. They're also gaining strength. And so I think it's important to understand that as long as there is this instability in Syria, it will remain a prime environment for radical jihadist groups to take root and grow. Today it could be ISIS, tomorrow it could be somebody else. And so when the Turks talk about the need to deal with Assad, I think that is a legitimate point they raise. And hopefully, if we can put forward an agenda that includes the Assad part of this whole situation, we could encourage them to be more active participants in the fight against ISIS.
Our FBI director says he's got open files on all 50 states of America now looking at people with potential connections to ISIS. Are the radical Islamists and jihadists here on our soil? How do we deal with that, and how do we fight radical Islam here on American soil?
Well, it's a threat that we have not been wholly prepared for. We largely have built our anti-terror programs on the notion that someone would come here from abroad and conduct an attack. And then we were worried about Americans who traveled abroad, were radicalized, and came back. And now we worry about people that never leave the United States, that are radicalized online or at a local mosque somewhere, and as a result take these actions. And that's the nature of the threat. And it's hard because unlike 10 years ago, these are not often well-defined plots that involve long-time planning. This increasingly involves potentially an individual that watches a few videos online, is inspired to take action, buys a gun or a bomb, and goes out and kills 10 people at a mall. I mean, these are the sorts of things that they're planning. And that's a much harder challenge. I think we need to be vigilant, but we also need to understand, as the FBI director has said, we won't be able to get them all. There will be attacks on American soil by terrorists because of the nature of this. But we need a more robust intelligence program that allows us to understand this new threat, that allows them to monitor them online before they can organize and carry out these attacks. And every one of these plots we were able to disrupt is a major success story. Over time, of course, it will involve the defeat of ISIS itself, because that is what is feeding this sort of radicalism today. They're the ones that are producing the videos and the content online that is inspiring people in this direction.
His predecessor, Robert Mueller, testified in Congress a few years ago that we apprehended like 59,000 people from countries other than Mexico illegally trying to come to this country. These countries included Somalia, Iran, Syria, Pakistan, all the usual suspects. How does the Rubio administration deal with border security, and how do you keep bad people and bad things like radioactive substances out of this country?
Well, first, it's important to point that the majority of people crossing the Mexican border for the first time ever are not from Mexico. They're coming from the northern triangle of Latin America, of Central America. It's Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. But they're also coming from all over the world. In essence, people have realized if you can get to Mexico, you can get into the United States because you can cross the border. The Mexicans have begun to realize this as well. And for the first time in many years, the Mexicans have become very serious about border security on their side of the border because they recognize that these are people coming into their country that if they can't make it across the border are going to stay in Mexico. And they don't want to have to deal with that either. So I do think there is now the opportunity to work closely with Mexican authorities to increasingly secure those portions of the border that remain porous. And part of that is to create the infrastructure on the ground, the fencing, the cameras, the sensors, that cut off these unauthorized points of crossing and basically narrows down the crossing points to only those authorized places where people cross the border. Because we transact a lot of business across that border every day. There are people that come across that border every day with millions of dollars of goods for trade and economic commerce. We don't want to shut that down. But if we can close off the illegitimate corridors of travel, then we can focus all of our attention and our monitoring on the legitimate crossings and improve our capabilities, for example, of finding a container that has weapons or smuggling people or radioactive material for that matter. And so I think one of the things we're going to have to do is work closely with our partners on the other side of the border in Mexico, who today have an increasingly vested interest in securing that border as well, because they understand that it's acting as a magnet for millions of people to sneak into Mexico before they sneak into America.
Does a fence come into play, a border security fence, a sensor technology, a combination?
It does. I mean, fencing is successful. We've seen it work in places like San Diego where the number of unauthorized crossings have diminished greatly. You know, if we're talking about illegal immigration, we have to understand that almost half of the people in this country illegally didn't cross the border. Physically, they came on an airplane with a visa. They overstayed the visa. So I think border security also means airports and seaports and an entry-exit tracking system that allows us to know in real time when people have overstayed their visas. But there are sectors of the border that we can secure through fencing, through sensors and cameras and drones and other technology. And what it will do is it will funnel more and more of that traffic to places that are easier to monitor and easier to control.
The ports and the harbors, we have no mine countermeasure capability on the entire East Coast or the Gulf Coast of this country. What would you do to improve port and harbor security in this country?
Well, that's an ongoing challenge. I know in Florida we have some major ports, and the security costs have always a matter of debate because the federal government creates these mandates, but it doesn't offer the funding. And I think we have improved our capabilities in many borders, but ultimately we live in an era of global commerce, and there will be, every single day, millions of, innumerable tons of material being sent abroad and coming in. And I think, as always, there are efforts to continue to improve our ability to monitor what's inside of a container, whether it's a weapon being smuggled in or something else that we don't, drugs or something we don't want in this country. It's an ongoing challenge. It will never be 100%. We know that. In the history of the world, you've never been able to seal a country off. But we can most certainly make it harder, improve our capabilities of detection, and hopefully deal with the root causes that are sending that stuff here so that it can diminish numerically the amount of things that are coming in, whether, again, it's weapons or people or a weapon of mass destruction for that matter.
Electromagnetic pulse. There's been pretty good evidence that maybe the Russians have an EMP warhead, the North Koreans. How do you view the electromagnetic pulse warhead, and what would you do to deal with it?
Well, it's a significant long-term threat. It's been described to people, and they think it's science fiction, but in fact it's reality. And part of it, I think the next president will have to make it a priority to harden critical infrastructure in this country, meaning our electrical grid, our key government operations, and over time hope the technology will allow us to harden other things like airplanes. You don't want airplanes falling out of the sky because of an electromagnetic pulse attack that wipes out the ability of those engines to function. This is a real threat, and that doesn't receive nearly enough attention because, as I said, it sounds like something from a horror movie. But it is, in fact, technology that is available to countries, increasing number of actors around the world, and potentially a non-state actor, a terrorist organization that could create tremendous havoc. So I do believe it must become a priority of this country to harden critical infrastructure, which we have the technology to do now that would insulate much of it and protect it from that sort of attack.
We've cut the U.S. Army to pre-World War II levels. We've got more admirals than we've got ships. How does the U.S. military look under a Rubio administration, how big of an army, how big of an air force, how big of a navy?
Well, the numbers and the capabilities have to be driven by the threat. And so a number of years ago, a bipartisan group of experts looked at our long-term defense needs and came up with what's known as the Gates Commission, the Gates funding level. They set a number. This is what it will cost, and this is what we should spend it on. We are about $40 to $50 billion under that each year. So basically, we are underfunding our military by about that amount. Earlier this year, I tried, in the budget that passed in the Senate, to restore funding for the military back to the Gates number. It would have just been for 1 year. In fact, we need to make that permanent. As president, I will make defense funding a priority. And it's not just about spending more money on the military, it's by spending it on the right things, by developing the research and technology that we'll need to defeat China's anti-access capabilities. The Chinese are building or have developed a $4 million rocket that can destroy a $4 billion aircraft carrier. We have to have countermeasures to defeat that. We have to have the ability to defend our space assets, satellites and so forth, from attack. Or we have to be able to defeat our critical infrastructure from cyber attack, which could blind our ability to communicate. It's important that we stay at the cutting edge. And the way I describe it to people is, whoever the commander-in-chief is 10 years from now, when they face a threat and their military officials come to them with options, what those options will be are being decided right now by what we are developing. And if we do not develop the cutting-edge technologies that allow us to keep our promise to our men and women in uniform, that they will always be the best trained, best equipped, and best informed fighting force on the ground or in the air, we don't invest in that capability, we won't be able to keep that promise to them.
Talking about the size of the military, the cost involved, we can train roughly 3 or 4 National Guardsmen for every 1 active duty soldier. How would the National Guard fit into your strategy?
Well, the National Guard is a critical part of our nation's defense infrastructure. They provide a service to our country that extends simply beyond military issues. We see them respond to every natural crisis, natural disaster. I know in Florida, every time we have a hurricane, and we had a number over the last decade, it's the National Guard that's there first. So they provide an invaluable service. What's changed over the last few years is the number of people in the National Guard that have been deployed. And so I continue to believe the National Guard is a critical part of that backbone, the ability to, if in fact we find ourselves in a crisis situation, quickly call up individuals in uniform that can provide for our national defense. I think they're part of that overall strategy that I outlined. They're included in that Gates number as an important and critical element of a 21st century national security system.
For the last years or so, the biological threat has been consistently ranked as one of the top threats from a security standpoint in this country. How would you deal with it and prepare for it?
Well, first of all, I think we want to be ahead of the curve in terms of any adversary developing a biological capability. I think we're always worried about, of course, is a terrorist organization that is able to develop a biological agent that they can disperse through the water supply or disperse in the air in a crowded place. And so this falls in line with all the other threats we've talked about from the terrorism perspective. Beyond it, when you talk about some of the biological pandemic threats, I do think that the Centers for Disease Control play a critical role in ensuring that our country is well stocked with the antiviral and or antidotes necessary to protect us from a chemical and or biological attack, and the ability to quickly deliver that to the right place. The Ebola crisis about a year ago really exposed, I think, some weaknesses in our system around the country in terms of the ability to rapidly respond to an incident should it occur. So I think part of our overall 21st century strategy is the ability to rapidly and quickly respond to a biological and or chemical attack anywhere it occurs in the country by ensuring that the right medicines or the right antidotes or the right responses are available quickly in any major community in this country that experiences something like this.
The 9/11 Commission said that 9/11 above all else was a failure of imagination. We're always responding to the last terrorist attack rather than thinking outside the box to prevent the next one. How would a Rubio administration think outside the box to prevent that next terrorist attack and keep America safe?
Well, this is a little bit of an insider conversation, but the National Security Council plays a critical role in that. Unfortunately, this president has turned the National Security Council into sort of a hyper State Department, an operational unit, as opposed to a strategic one. We desperately need people in our government that are constantly thinking ahead about what the next threat could be and how they could evolve. Because around the world there are terrorists that are constantly thinking of ways to defeat us. I promise you that around the world today, terrorists are not figuring out how to get a box cutter on an airplane anymore because they know we're looking for that. Instead, they're trying to develop all sorts of other things. that perhaps we haven't been prepared for. So I think understanding intelligence is critical in this, and our intelligence capabilities have eroded for a number of reasons. Some of them because of Snowden, some of them self-inflicted. But if we know what they're working on, it allows us to prepare to identify it. I think that's part of it. And I think part of it is having people sitting around constantly gaming out our vulnerabilities, thinking, a group of experts that are constantly thinking, if I was them, this is what I would do. And thinking about ways to prevent that, staying ahead of the curve. And so I think that's why it's so important to have people in government, particularly in the national security apparatus, who are thinking about future threats and trying to game out what the other side might do, as opposed to just thinking about how we're going to deal with a threat we already know exists or has existed in the past.
You mentioned Snowden, traitor? Or
Absolutely. The most devastating release of information in the history of this country. We know for a fact that there are enemies of the United States today who have changed the way they communicate, specifically based on the information he has released. If Mr. Snowden had concerns about U.S. intelligence programs, there were multiple different proper channels that he could have raised them. He didn't have to go to the Chinese or the Russians and turn over troves of important, valuable American information. And here's the bottom line. You may agree or disagree with our intelligence programs, but the fact is that today there are men and women in American uniforms who are in danger, because of the information that he has released. And by the way, some of the things he has released are flat out inaccurate. They are not true. They are flat out lies. And much of that information he has manipulated to turn himself into this heroic figure. He is without a doubt not just a traitor, but the information that he's delivered has had a devastating impact on our intelligence collections. And I can tell you, we know less about our adversaries today than we need to know or should have known because of the information he released. He's done terrible damage to this country and put the lives of real Americans at danger because of it.
You talked earlier about thinking outside the box to prevent that next terrorist attack and what the National Security Council can do. Boko Haram recently has begun border attacks on the country of Niger. Niger has one of the world's largest reserves of uranium.
Right.
What does President Rubio do?
Well, ultimately, as I said, that is a fight that needs to be won there locally. And we need to continue to assist them in that endeavor. Boko Haram, by the way, has pledged allegiance to ISIS. And it's important to understand that they're part of that global network that ISIS is now establishing across multiple countries that range all the way from Africa to the Caucasus and pose a real threat. And I think we need to view Boko Haram within the broader context of the war on terror, and particularly the war on ISIS. And I do think that is local African governments are doing the best they can to confront and to defeat it. We need to continue to provide assistance to them. In an ideal world, these threats are best defeated at the local level. I believe that the notion that we simply can't and won't invade or be involved on the ground in every single country on the planet where these things are occurring. But I think capacitating our local partners and trying to get other allies that are immediately impacted by it, interested in the idea of defeating them militarily is important. And we can provide a lot of assistance in that regard. We have the world's greatest intelligence, even though it's been diminished by things that I've just described. We still have the ability to identify things from the air through satellite imagery and intercepts that will allow us to improve the capacity of these countries. And ultimately, I also think we need to spend some time investing in the domestic capability, the counterterrorism capabilities of these countries, both in training and in the right weaponry and strategy that they need in order to effectively defeat these insurgencies / terrorist groups, terrorist armies.
It's pretty well documented that almost every time we buy energy from overseas, some portion of it goes to finance terrorism. How do you view energy as a national security issue, and what would a Rubio energy policy look like as
well,
national security?
The idea that what I don't want people to believe is that if we produce all this oil, that some of these countries around the world that are now benefiting from it will produce less of it. The truth is that every single day, hundreds of thousands of people join the global middle class. They buy cars, they fly in airplanes. Fuel needs are rapidly increasing. I do think it has enormous economic benefits to the United States. I believe to have domestic energy resources at our disposal. I think it lowers the cost of doing business in America, which will strengthen our economy, allow us to have a manufacturing renaissance and things of this nature. But ultimately, there will continue to be oil resources available to other countries, and some of it will continue to be siphoned off and used by terrorist groups. In fact, ISIS themselves sell oil in the global market because they've seized refineries that Assad has refused to destroy because he hopes to recapture them and use them once again. But I do think energy independence is critical to this country. Geopolitically, for example, it will allow us to help break some of the stranglehold, for example, that Putin has on Europe. Much of Europe today relies on natural gas that they get from Russia. And if the Russians can threaten to cut that off, it makes them vulnerable to pressure and from Putin and the Russian Federation. So I think in that realm it helps a lot geopolitically as well.
We're going to be taking questions now from the audience. We've got written questions that have come in. If you have them, Jonathan Hoffman is over here on the side. Please get them to him. One question, Senator, that we have from the audience today: what is the Senate's general opinion of Israel's defense capability?
What is the Senate?
What is the U.S. Senate's general opinion of Israel's defense capability?
Well, Israel is a very capable military force. It's interesting. The Israelis have never asked America to fight a war for them. They've never asked us to invade anyone. They've never asked us to send ground troops. The only thing they ask is that if they run out of bullets or run out of rockets, that we resupply them. The only thing they ask of us is that in global forums, we stand firmly on their side and deeply committed to their security. And I think it's in our national interest to do it. I have a moral connection to Israel that I believe in and of itself justifies our relationship. Israel was a nation that was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust to ensure that never again would there not be a homeland for the Jewish people to be able to go to and escape persecution. And I think that's a deep moral commitment that our country must honor. But I also think we have to remind ourselves geopolitically that Israel is the only free enterprise, pro-American democracy in the Middle East. If more countries in the Middle East looked like Israel, the world would be a lot safer, and this conversation today would be a lot shorter. And so there is at least one country in the Middle East that is a pro-American, free enterprise democracy, and we should ensure not that just that they survive, but that they prosper. And part of it is to continue our commitment to supply and resupply them if they come under assault. Not like what happened the last time when they came under assault by Hezbollah, and the administration dithered for weeks about supplying them the critical defense needs that they needed. Part of it is not turning over billions of dollars to Iran, who in turn will use it to improve the guidance capabilities of the rockets currently possessed by Hezbollah. Hezbollah today launches a bunch of rockets, but they're basically just aiming to hit anywhere in Israel. They're now increasing their guidance capabilities so that these rockets become tactical weapons that they can use to specifically target places within Israel. I think it's important for us to continue our commitment to the Iron Dome and to David's Sling and to any of these other defense mechanisms. But ultimately, if Israel gets in a crisis, the world needs to know that we will help them. We will help them with money. We will help them with weapons. We will help them with intelligence. We will do whatever it takes to help Israel defend itself.
What are the odds that the new deal with Iran gets overturned in Congress?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the majority of members of the House and Senate are going to vote against it. The real question is whether we can get 67 senators to vote against it, because that's what it will take to override a presidential veto. And to get 67, we need to get at least 13 or 14 Democrats to switch and vote with us. And that's really the battle right now, is can we convince enough of our Democratic colleagues in the Senate that this is not a good deal for the future of our country or the world. And that's where I think public pressure is increasingly important. And I think the month of August will be a critical time. We're going to have another hearing tomorrow in the Senate on this and take testimony from some experts. But ultimately, it is important that we be engaged in public advocacy, that we pressure our senators of the Democratic Party not to sign on to this deal. They need to know that in a couple of years from now, Israel comes under assault from Hezbollah. It is without a doubt, many, not all of those rockets that are hitting and killing Israelis were funded by the money that this deal loosened up and made available to the Iranian government. They need to know that.
Is it true that the Iran deal commits more money to Iran from the United States than we have given to Israel?
Well, I don't know how you measure that other than to say that it doesn't provide any direct U.S. aid to Iran, but what it... I just turned the phone. My microphone was hacked by the Iranians. But it does. What it does do is so you have all these money, Iranian money, frozen in bank accounts around the world. That money will now be released under this deal. So yes, it provides. The administration says between $50 and $100 billion of cash, which is a significant percentage of the GDP of Iran. This is a significant percentage of the size of their overall economy. It is a massive infusion of money that they will use. I know that they will use to do things like sponsor terrorism, which they've habitually done throughout the Islamic Republic's existence. The second thing that we need to understand is it now opens the way for more companies to do business in Iran, which will also prop up their coffers, which again they will use as well. So suddenly you have all these European companies, German, Italians, and others who are dying. They're just chomping at the bit to get back into Iran and do business there. This deal makes it possible for them to do that. If they did that work before, They couldn't do any work in the U.S. If you were a Deutsche Bank and you decided to provide financing to Iran before this deal, you would lose access to the U.S. marketplace. Under this deal, you're not going to be able to provide lines of credit and all sorts of capital, and the Iranians will use that, and they'll use that to rebuild their capabilities. And the administration insists, no, they're going to use this to rebuild their economy and take care of domestic concerns. I bet you that isn't what happens. I guarantee you that won't be what happens. I guarantee you that this money will be used to develop terrorism capabilities for their proxies around the region.
What are the three greatest national security threats facing the United States? And the person who asked this question has a footnote, and please don't say climate change.
Well, I mean, there are more than three that are worthy of our attention, but I think the first that we immediately are confronting is the threat militarily posed by Russia. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, it's a real threat because between the United States and Russia, we control 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. And when you have a Russian military that has openly now, admittedly, changed their military doctrine to, for the first time since the Cold War ended, openly contemplate the use of tactical military weapons in the battlefield to defeat a NATO assault, you've run into a very dangerous situation. When you suddenly see them taking these aggressive moves to test NATO, you run the very real risk of miscalculation. If Putin comes to believe, Putin is convinced that he's going to test Article 5, that he's going to prove to the world that NATO is a paper tiger, and he's going to continue to push the edge on it. And the argument he's trying to make to NATO is, look, if we decide to move on the Baltic states, the U.S. isn't going to go to war with us over that. And if he can convince them of that, NATO becomes just a piece of paper. And the notion that he could miscalculate and actually do that is a tremendous risk and threat of a hot war starting between Russia and the United States. And that's a major risk when you have the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world facing off, even in a conventional showdown, that could rapidly escalate in a way that we find to be unpredictable. Because we are dealing with a Vladimir Putin that in many respects is much more unpredictable and much more dangerous in his activities than we used to see in some of the former Soviet leaders 35 years ago. The second risk that we face, which is very significant, is the risk of radical Islam. And it's spread throughout the world. And it poses a new world 21st century risk that is not totally like that of a nation state. They don't necessarily have a capital city, although ISIS claims it has one. They don't have an economy that we can target. They don't have a conventional military force. They pose threats that you understand include not just local fighting forces that take over territory and behead people and do these sorts of things, but also people they are inspiring around the world who don't carry an ISIS membership card. But they go online and they become inspired to take an attack, and they can launch attacks against us. And the risk of that continuing to spread around the world is extremely, is real. And the third, I think the longer picture, I think the one that will be the dominant 100 years from now, when people look back at the history of this time, the one that they will look at and say that is what really shaped the world, is the relationship between the United States and China. That will really determine much of what the next century looks like. China is a rising power. It's the largest country in the world. They're expanding their military capabilities. They're facing some significant headwinds internally, but they're going to continue to grow as a country. And the question is, how does China's rise balance with America's standing in the world? And unfortunately, if you look throughout history, a rising power and a status quo power have ended up going to war. And I don't think that's what's going to happen with China. But it's posing real risks already. For example, China has decided to begin to act on their claim that they own the South China Sea. And they've begun to build artificial islands. And once they build these islands, they can claim territorial rights that extend out 12 miles. And if you start to concentrically put those circles together, you realize China claims they own the most important shipping lane in the world. We cannot allow in the 21st century for any country to dominate an international shipping lane. We don't do that. And that's much of the success of the 20th century was because of the freedom of navigation in the seas. And I think it's important for us to challenge that notion and to ensure that the Chinese understand that the costs of doing that are going to be much higher than any benefits they think they're going to generate from it.
We live in an age center where technology is increasing so rapidly, but our government is so stovepiped and lacks the ability to adapt and to respond quick enough. So it's almost as if as the technology increases, the threats are increasing exponentially.
Right.
How does President Rubio deal with that stovepiping in the government so we can respond quicker to threats?
First, it's just understanding what you just outlined. Most of the people running for president have no idea what you're talking about when you said that. They may have a lot of experience on the issues we faced 18 years ago, but they have no idea what you just said. Look at how much our economy has changed. And this was rattled off some facts that really will blow your mind when you think about it. Remember the old economy and what it was? Well, think about the new economy. In the new economy, the largest hospitality company in the world, Airbnb, doesn't own a single hotel room. The largest ground transportation company in America, Uber, doesn't own a single car. The largest retailer in the world, Amazon, doesn't own a single store. That's how much the economy has changed. And let me tell you how fast it's changing. It took the telephone 75 years to reach 100 million users. It took Instagram 2 years to reach 100 million users. And that game Candy Crush, it reached 100 million users in 1 year. So not only is the world changing, it's changing faster than it ever has. There is no way that government policies designed for the old economy and the old world could possibly deal with these changes, not to mention how fast these changes are moving. And one of the most important issues of this election is whether or not we are going to elect people to the highest office in the land and to government that understand this. That understand that you can't regulate Uber like a taxi cab, and you can't treat ISIS like some threat from the 20th century. And we need to have a government that can rapidly respond to these challenges and is thinking ahead and realizes that by the time you're done regulating something, it doesn't exist anymore. Something new has replaced it. And in fact, if you try to over-regulate it, you'll end up costing yourself that economic opportunity. So when I talk about the need to turn the page on the past, this is what I'm talking about. We better start electing people in this country that understand the 21st century, or the future is going to leave us behind.
What is your view of foreign aid?
I support foreign aid if it's done appropriately. Number one, it's less than 1% of our budget. So anyone that tells you that foreign aid is the driver of our debt is just not telling you the truth. Number two, I think there is foreign aid that's been very successful, and then there is foreign aid that has not been. So you want some success stories of foreign aid? Colombia. Colombia was basically a failed state 20 years ago, dominated by narco-terrorists and narco-traffickers. Today, Colombia still faces significant challenges, but it is a stable, increasingly prosperous country, and it is the strongest American ally in South America. Not only are the Colombians a capable military force that partner very closely with ours. In fact, if you look at their special operation forces, they wear the same uniforms, use the same weapons, train the exact same way as our special operations people do. I was in Colombia in December and watched them work. And you talk to the Americans that work with them, and they tell you, we will go into battle anywhere in the world alongside the Colombians, because we train them, we work with them, and we trust them. Well, the Colombians are now offering to use those special operation forces to defeat narco-terrorists in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador. They've even offered to help the Mexicans with some of these threats. That's an example of how foreign aid has turned a country that was about to fail into a strong, prosperous, and reliable American ally. And here's another one, South Korea. 30 years ago, the South Korean economy was smaller than the North Korean economy. 15 years ago, South Korea was still a recipient of foreign aid. Today, South Korea has a developed economy, one of the 10 largest in the world, and today South Korea is a donor, not a recipient of foreign aid. It is a donor and a strong American ally in the Asia-Pacific region, again, made possible through American assistance. And then there are challenges. We've put millions of dollars into Haiti, and we find out that with all the money we've put in there, enough progress hasn't been made. We still fund foreign aid projects in the world, some of which is being siphoned off by corrupt officials. So I do think we need to redo foreign aid, but I'll put one more point forward. I also think foreign aid gives us leverage to change the world. About 2 weeks ago or a month ago, I passed a bill in the Senate called the Girls Count Act. And here's what it basically says. It says that if you receive foreign aid, you must give little girls birth certificates. Let me tell you why that matters. If your little girl is born anywhere in the world and they don't have a birth certificate, it makes them a prime target to being trafficked, to being enslaved, to not receiving education. And half the world's population in many developing countries, young girls do not exist in the roles of government. And therefore it is easy to basically kidnap them and sell them as a domestic laborer or sell them as a sex slave. And American foreign aid will now say that if you're going to receive American foreign aid, you must take concrete steps to change that, because girls count. I'm proud that we passed that bill. I'm proud that the President signed it. And I think as an example of how we are using existing spending to improve the world in a way that enhances our prestige and our standing in the world in the eyes of millions of people.
Looking back on your life experiences, what do you believe best prepares you to be Commander-in-Chief?
Well, it begins, I think, with a clear understanding of what America's role in the world should be. We are not just another country. And I know that some people, Americans, have never been necessarily comfortable with the idea that we must be the most influential country in the world. Most of us would rather just focus on issues here at home. start our businesses, raise our families, go to work every day, retire with dignity. America has no desire to conquer any more territory. We're not interested in invading any country and turning it into the 51st state. That's not what we want, and that's not what we do. The problem is, for reasons we don't fully understand, America has been charged with this task of being the most influential nation on earth. And I would just say to you, the world is always going to have a more influential country. And that influential country is going to help shape and determine what the world looks like. And it is not a coincidence that since the end of World War II, democracy and freedom and liberty and peace has broken out throughout the world. You know why? Because the most powerful country in the world was a free enterprise democracy and a peaceful people. That's why the world took that direction. That's why we didn't have a third world war. So in the 21st century, we have a choice. Either we remain the most powerful country in the world, or we will be replaced by another country, like China, that does not respect human rights, that does not respect religious liberties, that does not allow its people unfettered access to the internet and to information, that tells churches who their bishops are, who their cardinals are, who their pastors can be. Is that what we want the most powerful country in the world to be? A nation that does not respect the dignity and the rights of their own people, not to mention others? Because if that's the most powerful country in the world will change, and every single one of us will feel the impact of it. So I'm guided by that belief, by the understanding that America isn't just indispensable, it's exceptional. Guided by the reality that yes, the world oftentimes grumbles because America is telling them what to do, they think, or getting involved in issues. But here's the truth. When we don't, they complain even louder. When we don't lead, the world says to us, chaos is breaking out because America is not leading. I believe I'm qualified because I believe, and I know for a fact, especially over the last 5 years of being engaged on these issues, I know what happens when America doesn't lead. What happens is chaos. What happens is violence. What happens is war. What happens is radical jihadists grow and prosper. That is not the world I want to live in. That is not the world I want to leave our children. So whether we like it or not, this extraordinary nation has been tasked with the role of being the leader of the free world. And it is not a role we should give up, because the alternative is that the world will return to an age of darkness and violence and a lack of freedoms. That's not the world I want to leave for my children.
You mentioned a previous question, you talked about South Korea, North Korea. That Taekwondo missile that Kim Jong-un has looks a whole lot like the Shahab missile of Iran's. How do you, and he's increasing the distance of that, the range of that. How do you deal with the North Korean regime today?
Well, I don't know if people realize this, but North Korea already possesses a rocket that could hit California. Now they're not very good at aiming. We don't know what they're going to hit, but they're going to hit something. And that's a real risk. And that's why it's so important, for example, that Japan has continued to develop its defense capabilities. Japan is a very capable Navy, probably the 5th best Navy in the world. People don't realize it. But now, for the first time in their history, they're going to be able to provide collective self-defense, which means they're not going to have to, for years after World War II, Japan could only get engaged in a conflict if they were directly attacked. That meant that an American ship or missiles launched against the United States, they couldn't do anything about it. Now they're going to be able to actually do something about it, and that is a significant force multiplier for us. What that will do is improve our capability to provide anti-missile defenses at the front lines of that conflict, right there in Asia, before it even crosses the Pacific. And that also, if we can figure out a way to get Japan and South Korea to work even closer on some of these issues, will multiply our capabilities even further. And I think that's the first line of defense, is to ensure that any rocket that's launched by North Korea will be shot down before it strikes Japan, South Korea, or the continental United States.
If you were president today, with the current government in Afghanistan and Iraq, how would you work with them, and how would it differ from the current?
Well, first of all, we would stop this artificial timeline of getting out of Afghanistan by a date certain. I think we need to, eventually, Afghanistan needs to be turned over to the Afghan people. But if we leave too early, or too quickly, or irresponsibly, we will undo all of the gains that have been made. And there are still significant challenges there. In fact, we don't know the full brunt of those significant challenges, because when you tell the Taliban we're leaving in a date certain, they'll just wait till you leave before they really launch their attacks. But here's what we know. Every time we leave a province, the Taliban gains influence in that province. And so I think we're going to have to continue to be committed to security unless we want Afghanistan to become the next Iraq. Iraq is a mess because this president artificially pulled out from it in an artificial timeline without working harder on a status of forces agreement that allowed us to have a presence there. Had we done that, I think the government there would have been much more stable and the conditions less conducive to what happened. When we pulled out of Afghanistan, Maliki went full Maliki and really used his power to go after Sunnis. And so what happened is these Sunnis felt oppressed by Baghdad. They felt oppressed by the central government. And so when ISIS came in, they initially greeted ISIS as liberators from those Shia oppressors. They don't feel that way anymore, but it's too late. Now they're already there. I think it's important for us to figure out a way to work with our Iraqi allies to create a country that is inclusive of Christians, Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia. If we don't do that, Iran will dominate Iraq. And suddenly they will again get another puppet state.
So we're coming to the end, and I want to thank you on behalf of Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security. I want to thank you. We know how busy you are. We want to thank you for coming to South Carolina. And last question, is there anything that we didn't ask today that you want to tell the people of South Carolina?
Well, you asked a lot of questions, so I think we covered all.
You gave a lot of answers.
I just want to thank you for this. Look, I think that the most important obligation of the federal government is to provide for our national security. We do a lot of things at the federal government that we'd like to do or maybe should do, but the one thing we must do is provide for our national security. If a nation is not secure, it cannot prosper economically. The American dream cannot grow, and it cannot reach people if this is a nation under threat and under duress. And the next president of the United States, and quite frankly, your leaders you elect to Congress and the Senate, need to be people that clearly understand this, that clearly understand the world as it is, not the way we wish it was, and that understand that America plays an indispensable role in the world, that when America fails to lead, chaos ensues, and the result is a world that's less prosperous, less stable, and less peaceful. And so I hope this election will give us an opportunity to restore our prestige on the world stage and reinvigorate the role we play to lead the free people of this planet.
Senator Rubio and Mr. Hook, thank you so much for an enlightening conversation on behalf of APPS and Furman University. Thank you very much, and thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.